source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. In the spring of 2000, the lifeless body of a teenage girl is found in the Lorette River, near a suburb of Quebec City. The investigation will uncover the story of a crime of passion involving two young lovers. L'Ancienne Lorette is a small and peaceful community located about 10 kilometers from Quebec City. On April 7, 2000, two students walk in a wooded area near their school. Along the river, they spot what they think is a mannequin laying at the edge of the water. Moving closer, they realize it's a dead body. Terrified, they immediately alert a teacher who contacts the police.
We received a call to the effect that L'Ancienne Lorette high school students had found a body in the Lorette River. Following that, a team of investigators, including Detective Sergeant Charlène Paquette and Ghislaine Martel, went to the scene to begin our investigation.
At the time, Remy Doyon was a forensic identification specialist for the Sainte Foy police.
Even before I left, I contacted the officers to make sure they secured a large crime scene and to prevent anyone from entering the area by using police tape around the perimeter. It's important. If the public or even the police enter the scene, a lot of evidence can be destroyed. That gave me a huge crime scene of about 4,000 square feet to examine. Before we touch anything, even the victim, I take a lot of photographs so that if I disturb something or if someone else touches something, we have a photographic record as a reference. My routine is to work outward from the victim, and I use very particular methods to ensure no part of the crime scene is overlooked. I saw the body lying in the water, about 30 to 40 meters away from me. She was caught on the rocks. The current may have carried her to that point, or the crime may have occurred there. I saw a person for sure, fairly long hair, but I couldn't determine for certain if the body was male or female. It was fully clothed and dressed appropriately for the weather. It was April, and she had on a jacket and pants that appeared to be correct for the season. It wasn't until I was on the same side of the river as the victim and turned the body over that I realized it was a girl. Physically, her hands appeared normal, and her face was not emaciated. Her skin tone was okay for a victim, I mean. Her color was okay, and she was not very decomposed. There wasn't anything telling us her body was not in an advanced state of decomposition. The water was quite cold, about 5 degrees Celsius, which helped to preserve the condition of the body. Whether it was there for 24 hours or 48 hours, 72, we couldn't determine at that time.
Are the police dealing with a crime or an accident?
There was no evidence that the victim had been sexually assaulted. She was fully clothed, including her underwear, and her pants had not been removed. So, as far as we were concerned, it was not a crime of a sexual nature.
Although at the time we could certainly see that there were some wounds to the neck and throat area, the injuries were not large. They were small, but something had definitely stabbed her there a few times. It couldn't be determined whether that's what really killed her or if she had actually drowned. But one thing was certain. From that moment, we were sure this was not a natural death, so all necessary precautions were taken. We always begin with the worst-case scenario, so we start by assuming it's a crime. We work according to this rule so that we don't overlook crucial evidence by moving too quickly.
Police gather all the evidence they can find at the scene and mark each item with an exhibit number.
To do a thorough search on such a large crime scene takes quite some time. After all of the evidence was marked, we turned the body over and brought it out of the river.
It's very important for us to get the body out of the water as intact as possible and then search it in order to identify the victim.
That's how investigators begin their investigation. If you have a victim without identification, there is nothing for the investigator to start with.
In searching the victim's clothes, Remy Doyon discovers some small balls of paper in the pocket of her jeans.
It was a piece of white paper with a telephone number written on it. It was written in ink and still very legible. The water had not caused any deterioration. There were spots of mud on the paper, but it was still quite legible. And then there was another ball of paper, which could be unraveled immediately. It was a portion of a bus transfer. I'd photographed this evidence at the scene, and we transcribed the details for the investigator immediately. I dried the papers overnight and then sent them to the exhibit room for use as evidence.
The body of the young woman is removed from the crime scene and is pronounced dead by the coroner before being transported to the morgue in Quebec City.
We needed to establish where the stabbing occurred. So when we considered the current, the width of the river, and all the log debris, the body could not have moved a great distance.
It seemed to me the next most important thing was to walk upstream, because although she could have come from the shore, the crime could have taken place a little higher upstream on the bank, and her body could have been brought down by the current. So it was mainly the riverbank that interested me as the crime scene. We look for things that may be directly involved, a weapon, items like that, but it is rare that those objects are what will lead us to the murderer. The evidence may be of no apparent significance on the day itself, but a few months later, an item can turn out to be of huge importance. It is often like this at a crime scene. We collect evidence without knowing whether it will be important, but instinctually pick it up anyway.
The search for clues continues for hours. At one point, Remy Doyon makes a curious discovery. Engraved on the trunk of a tree is the inscription Melio, followed by a heart pierced by an arrow and the initials TP.
It told me nothing. I didn't see this being any more relevant than any other evidence here. But actually, the carving on the tree was quite recent. So I took a photograph, and it subsequently made it into the file as evidence. But at the time, it was inconclusive and did not seem to serve any real purpose. We advised the chief investigator of the carving, but nothing came of it at the time.
Remy Doyon completes his examination of the crime scene and then goes to the morgue. The next day, the body of the young victim will be transported to Montreal, where all Quebec autopsies take place. He wants to make sure they haven't missed anything during the search of the clothing, and that the victim's hands are well protected in case they hide traces of the murderer's DNA. He also has to take fingerprints.
At the scene, it's impossible to take fingerprints because the fingers, you know, when you take a bath and stay too long in the water, how your fingers will feel? Then try to imagine how wrinkled your fingers could be if immersed for several days.
Given the wrinkled condition of the victim's fingers, Remy Doyon must reinflate the skin.
We use a syringe to inject water under the skin, which fills out the wrinkles. Once that's done and you take a look, the finger will appear almost normal. We can then spread a little ink on the finger and then roll the prints. At that moment, the imprint can be quite good. The print I took of the middle finger was very good.
Despite her obvious young age, no one reported the victim missing in the days before her body was discovered. Who is she? How did she come to such a tragic end? The body of a young woman with stab wounds in the neck is found face down in the Lorette River near Quebec City. Her identity remains unknown, and there have been no reports of a missing person in the region. Armed with only a woman's name and a phone number scribbled on a piece of paper found in the victim's pants, Detective Sergeant Le Godard begins his search for the killer.
Once we finished with the crime scene and began our investigation, we tried to establish the relationship of the name and phone number to our victim because there was no other identification. We found the address corresponding to the phone number, which was a young woman in Saint Roch, Quebec.
Saint Roch is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Quebec City. At the time, it was home to many homeless, addicts, and prostitutes.
My colleague, Detective Sergeant Charlene Paquette, and I went to speak to the young woman in Saint Roch. We showed the girl photographs of the victim's clothes. She confirmed that the items belonged to her and that she had loaned them to a young girl named Tanya Pinette.
The young woman explained she had recently met Tanya and agreed to let her stay with her. Tanya left her backpack at the apartment, but never returned for it.
She loaned the clothes to Tanya on March 30th, 2000, and said Tanya told her that she was going to l'Ancienne Lorette to see her boyfriend. She sensed that Tanya was nervous about going back to him.
Based on the information given by the young woman, investigators learned Youth Protection had placed Tanya at the Stopover Center, a shelter for young women in need. She was only 15 years old. Le Godard immediately contacts the center.
An official from the youth center came to the morgue to identify the body. Tanya Pinette was positively identified as one of their charges. Following confirmation of the victim's identification, we now had names of individuals who knew the victim while she was a runaway during the month of November 1999. We met with all these young people who were friends of the victim while she was a runaway. They knew what she did and who she met up with until her death.
Jusqu'à son décès.
One of the people the investigators question is Tanya's older sister, also a Stopover Center resident. She tells them that Tanya was dating a young man named Jesse Baroui. He and Tanya reportedly lived together. Apparently, Tanya wanted to return to Sept-Îles, her hometown, to live with her grandparents. Jesse allegedly threatened to kill her if she left him.
We sent 2 detective sergeants to ask Jesse Baroui to meet with us at our offices. Jesse stated he wasn't interested in doing that. But after calling his lawyer, he agreed to come to our offices for questioning.
Jesse said he hadn't seen Tanya for over a week. Her father had come to stay with them for a few days, but after an argument, Jesse had thrown them both out. All the information police have so far points to Jesse as their prime suspect, but what the investigators need now is proof that he is the killer. The results of the autopsy conducted by the late Dr. Louis Raymond Trudeau have become available. Jacinthe Prévost is a forensic biologist at the Laboratory of Forensic Science and Forensic Medicine in Montreal. She worked on the Tanya Pinette case.
Swabs were taken of the mouth, vaginal, and rectal areas, and then sent to pathology. The results of these tests indicated there was no evidence of semen at all. Often when a woman is killed like this, we investigate whether there is any evidence of a sexual assault, and we look for anything that could be related to that. There weren't any bloodstains other than those of the victim. There was no male profile associated with the victim's body.
Donc, il n'y avait pas de profil mâle associé à son corps.
If there are bloodstains present from a potential assailant, one might find those on the victim's back. Even in the case of a water environment, the genetic profile can still be found in the washed out blood. If there was a sexual assault, water has no impact in the vagina or oral cavities. We found no drug or substance toxicology, and the blood alcohol was negative. We found 8 small wounds, about half a centimeter wide, on the right side of the victim's neck. At least 2 of the wounds had punctured the carotid artery, which could have been fatal. However, the official cause of death was attributed to drowning. So while these stab wounds to the neck were created by a thin, single-edged blade, the victim actually drowned. That was the cause of death.
After being stabbed, was the victim drowned by her assailant, or did she drown while looking for help? Denis Legodard's colleague, Charlene Paquette, attends the autopsy.
When we met with Detective Sergeant Paquette, she explained that when she first met the suspect on the 9th, he had in his possession a knife. This knife was very similar to the one that caused the injuries on the victim's neck.
Finding the knife is a priority for Legodard. Because the investigation is in its early stages, he must first consider all evidence and any information provided, as improbable as it may seem to him. To prepare a strong case, he must determine the accuracy of each clue and establish its importance. Legodard's objective is to address any argument that a defense lawyer could present in a future trial.
The victim had a history of self-harm, which was problematic in creating a case. We had to remove the possibility that the victim stabbed herself. To eliminate that possibility, I would have to find a knife at the scene.
The investigator came to see me to ask if we could search the riverbed. I said yes, we can always search with a metal detector. However, the river is about 1 foot deep and we can't see the bottom as such because the spring runoff water is not clear at all. But he said I want more than that. So I said, okay, I'll look into what we can do.
Sergeant Doyon had heard about a new technology that was effective in damming a river almost instantly.
The police called me simply because they wanted to look for clues at the crime scene. And then, well, they knew that placing the water barrier in the river would replace hundreds of sandbags and save time.
The water barrier is made of polymer canvas, a very resistant material. It's made so that when it unfolds, its 2 panels make up a 90-degree angle. One of the panels is held down with rocks or other heavy objects. As soon as water starts to flow into it, the other panel acts as a parachute. The pressure created by the water current holds it in place.
I brought a water barrier 28 inches deep by 35 feet long. And then I also brought a large pump in order to pump all of the water from the river, because we simply can't stop the water indefinitely. The water will eventually go right over the barrier.
They pumped the water out on top of the riverbank because the river we were in goes around a sort of bend there. So we had nearly 200 feet in which to search for evidence in the riverbed.
Once it was installed, the barrier remained in position for a period of perhaps 5 or 6 hours, long enough for the investigators to thoroughly search for clues.
Even though there was minimal water in the riverbed, we used the metal detectors anyway. It was much better that way, and we could really search the river the way we should.
Will the investigators find the murder weapon? Or will they determine that Tanya committed suicide? The lifeless body of Tanya Pinette is found in the Lorette River near Quebec City. She was 15 when she had run away from a young woman's shelter. Investigators are looking for her murder weapon in the river. They install a water barrier to assist their search.
So, By diverting the water from the riverbed and the banks, no weapon was found. That proved to us that the victim had not committed suicide.
Had it been a suicide, the weapon would still be at the scene. But since Le Godard didn't find anything, he assumes the assailant took the weapon with him.
Therefore, what interested us now was recovering the knife that had been seen in the possession of the suspect.
Le Godard orders a search of the apartment where Tanya and her boyfriend Jesse had lived together.
One must understand that 10 days after the victim's body was discovered, the suspect gave up his apartment in La Lorette and went back to live with his mother.
Since the suspect no longer lived in the apartment, a warrant was not required for investigators to conduct a search of the premises. From what I know of the law, because he was no longer a tenant there and he had left, the process moved far more rapidly than it would have otherwise. It can sometimes be easier to analyze a crime scene, an apartment, or a vehicle because it is no longer owned or inhabited by the suspect.
Our goal was to determine whether the crime was committed in the apartment.
My specialty is forensic biology, but particularly the study of blood stains and blood spatters. Therefore, I work primarily on serious crime scenes. That is to say, homicides or attempted murders. I also look for blood stains and blood spatter on clothing or on objects used in crimes. The murder weapons or different things like that. I take samples and I make determinations of biological substances. The blood, of course, but also saliva, semen, and hair. Then we do serologic testing. That is to say, we determine the nature of the biological substance, and then when necessary, we do a genetic study. We determine the genetic profile of biological substances and compare that to the victim. That way, one can find the victim's blood. For instance, on the suspect's clothing or a weapon, and one can also find, for example, the genetic profile and semen found in the victim's vagina, which could be compared with the genetic profile of a suspect we have obtained an arrest warrant for. I started working on the Tanya Pinette case nearly 3 weeks after her discovery, so after the autopsy. Investigators had made a lot of progress in the investigation. I was asked to search for bloodstains in the residence Tanya Pinette shared with her boyfriend. So it's a little apartment, 2-bedroom, I think, small, empty. All I had to do was search for blood on the floors, walls, in the bathroom, and then on the mattress that was left there. So certainly when we arrive on a crime scene, even a crime scene we suspect has been cleaned, which was the case there, we need a good light. We look for the presence of bloodstains at the bottom of the walls, between the edges of hardwood flooring, for example, at the bottom of doors, and anywhere that is hidden or dark. Often when bloodstains have been cleaned, it is done only as far as they can see and not on those places where it is dark. For example, on dark floors, dark furniture, cabinets, or cabinet toe kicks, sometimes you can find traces of blood. In this case, the visual search for blood was negative. I used a product called luminol, which in the dark emits a blue-green luminescence, but in the presence of blood, it becomes bright blue. I found 2 tiny spots of blood on the mattress. In fact, it was a brown substance which was at least partly blood. I then found 1 drop of blood on the door frame in the bathroom. So that's all I found. The rest of the apartment was free of bloodstains or spatter. And if there had been a large amount of blood spilled and the area had been cleaned, we still could have found the stains by using the luminol. But that's not necessarily true if it's been shampooed. The 2 spots on the mattress were about 2 centimeters in diameter, so small brown spots. The lab is located in Montreal, so we left l'ancienne Lorette, and in the days that followed, I analyzed the bloodstains. I had them extracted to obtain DNA and then amplified them to get a genetic profile. I also took a blood sample from the victim for comparison. The 2 spots of blood on the mattress gave combinations of genetic profiles which were similar to what we would obtain if we took that man combined with the DNA profile of Tanya Pinette. So there is a combination of a man and Tanya Pinette, the same man who left his drop of blood against the door frame and the 2 spots on the mattress. So it was 2 small spots, but we could not confirm from these 2 spots that the crime happened there because we knew from the investigation that Tanya Pinette slept there. It could have been menstruation blood, for example, which was not established. Following the analysis of the suspect's apartment, we could not conclude that there was a significant spill connected to the homicide or death of Tanya Pinette.
For investigators, it's evident that the crime was committed at the Lorette River. Tanya's clothing returns from the Forensic Science Laboratory in Montreal.
Then the clothes were returned from the forensics lab. They were now dry and separated into individual bags. We then decided to search the pockets again. It was dry. It was easier now that we were not in the river or in the mud. So we opened the clothing, looking for small cuts that there could be on the clothes. We searched inside them and the pockets again. And in the pant pockets, I found 2 more pieces of balled up paper, now dry. Therefore, impossible to work with them.
Remy Doyon photographs the new evidence and classifies each exhibit. On May 17th, police conduct a second search, this time at the home of Jesse's mother, where he now lives.
We needed to recover all the clothes that were in Jesse Barrowie's possession. His coat, his boots, his pants, in the hopes of finding the victim's DNA.
Investigators also seize the knife Jesse has on his keychain and send it to the Laboratory of Forensic Science in Montreal.
Mrs. Prévost begins her forensic investigation.
I searched for blood on the clothing, boots, shoes. It was negative, and I made a report to that effect. Upon visual examination of the knife, there were no bloodstains. It was a small, retractable knife. You know, the kind of small Swiss Army knife with a blade and a file on one side, and scissors on the other side that you can fold into the structure of the handle. And the blade of the knife was similar in length and width to what the pathologist wrote in his report about the wounds on the right side of the victim's neck.
Will Jacinth Prévost find the blood of Tanya Pinette on the knife of Jesse Barrowie? Did Jesse do more than just utter death threats? The lifeless body of Tanya Pinette is found in the Lorette River near Quebec City. A search of Jesse Barrowie's apartment, where he lived at the time of the crime, reveals no substantial bloodstains, indicating that the assault took place at the river. There was no trace of Tanya's blood on Jesse's clothing, but he remains a suspect in the case. Jacinth Prévost analyzes Jesse's pocket knife in hopes of finding the victim's blood.
So I used the testing guidelines to detect the presence of blood, even if it is invisible to the eye. and there was a slight discoloration. I could detect the presence of a little bit of blood. I figured that the knife had maybe been washed. It makes sense. We can't see blood. It could be the right knife, but it's been washed. As there is a handle that allows the blade, file, and scissors to close up inside of it, I told myself that maybe it hadn't been washed thoroughly. By opening it, we might find blood if the knife did indeed have any on it at some point. So in opening the plastic knife handle, I found bits of dried blood, and it turned out to match the genetic profile of the victim. That's how investigators were able to link the knife from their suspect to the victim.
Le couteau de leur suspect avec la victime.
This is a major breakthrough for investigators, but they still must remove any possibility of doubt. In this case, there are no witnesses. Only the suspect knows the truth. When police interrogate him, they must be aware of every piece of evidence, direct or circumstantial. They must be able to demonstrate that they know the suspect is guilty. Meanwhile, Remy Doyon decides to re-examine the balls of paper found in Tanya's clothing following the autopsy.
I got up one morning and thought, I didn't pick those little balled up pieces of paper for nothing. I brought them to the laboratory and I put them in water so they would be soaked and I could reopen them without tearing or damaging them. And the next day, after being in water for 24 hours, I gently opened them with tweezers. I realized that these two pieces of paper went with the first bus transfer. They were two pieces of the transfer and completed it. We could now make out everything on the bus ticket. I didn't stick the pieces together, but assembled them in such a way that I could take a photograph of the entire ticket. I developed the photo and gave it to the investigator to add to his file. Then he immediately left with it.
We met people from the transit service who gave us the description of a bus ticket, a transfer, how it worked, why they punched holes where they did, and they told us that each driver had a unique hole punch. When you take the bus, you get your ticket punched. It can be a drawing, anything, but every driver has his unique punch.
Investigators meet with the bus driver who owns the hole punch, but he has no memory of Tanya.
It's unclear. I mean, we're in Quebec City and many people take the bus.
The important thing is that the bus ticket corroborates the statement of the woman in St. Roch, who loaned Tanya clothes on the day she was last seen alive. It proves that on March 30th of last year, Tanya took the bus downtown in the direction of Lancienne Lorette. Le Godard's strategy works. The trail is clear and leads directly to the murderer. The next element to be resolved is the carving on the tree.
L'histoire de l'arbre, d'abord, on se souvient.
We remember that initially, on the day we found the victim, I photographed a tree, a conifer that was easily 12 to 14 inches in diameter. In the picture, you could see a carving, which was perhaps 5 or 6 centimeters by 10 centimeters high.
During the investigation, we learned that Milio was a nickname he had. Finding that hard with the nickname of the suspect and the victim told us that they knew this area, which was very important in order to press charges.
After reviewing the photos, investigator Le Godard comes to see me and asks me if we can determine how long before the photograph was taken was the engraving done. I referred him to the University of Laval.
That's the first time in 34 years I had an autopsy done of a tree. I went to the Faculty of Forestry at Laval University and met with Guimond Ouellette, who is a forest pathologist. At that time, I had been retired since 1995, but I continued to work at the research center where I used to work before, so he explained the situation to me.
Along with Legodard and Dion, Guimond Ouellette goes to Lucette Lorette to examine the tree.
There were a lot of these little black spots that we identified as being insects whose flight period is between mid-June and late July, which means that when they were in flight, there was already enough sap for them to get their feet caught in, and it was soft enough for them to get encrusted in it. If it was sap that had secreted the previous year, it would have hardened and the insects could not have gotten stuck, especially near the carving.
Guimond Ouellette wants to be doubly sure he's right. He pushes the experiment further.
We tried to imitate the carving on the tree just above the original carving. I made the sample carving in September, about September 15th, I think, to verify if an abundance of sap would flow in autumn on 2 or 3 areas of the tree.
And then he asked me to come and photograph that carving every day for the 10 days that followed. Each time I photographed it with the same kind of film, the same type of camera, and with almost the same distances. Although the distance was less important because they were instruments of measurement that I photographed at the same time as the wound.
The results of the tree's autopsy are one of the last elements needed for Legodard to complete his investigation. The answer will tell him if the carving was made around the same time the murder occurred. Will the carving on the tree trunk contain the final clue he needs to solve Tanya's murder? In April 2000, Tanya Pinette is found drowned in the Lorette River near Quebec City. 8 small wounds were found on her neck, 2 of which punctured the carotid artery. Although no traces of Tanya's blood have been found either in her boyfriend's apartment or on his clothing, it was discovered on his pocket knife. Forest pathologist Guimond Ouellette conducts tests on the tree trunk on which the suspect's nickname and the initials of the victim were carved. His primary objective is to determine when the carving was made.
So, on the side of the tree that had no carving, there was no sap. Now, in the sample carving I made, there was sap, but not in abundance, so it showed that during the fall, there shouldn't be much sap flow. I couldn't establish an exact date, but for sure it couldn't be traced back to the previous fall.
This demonstrates that the carving was made at about the same time the murder occurred. For Legodard, this represents a step in the right direction in his pursuit of Tanya's killer.
From the outset of the investigation, after the autopsy, our suspect was already targeted. With his history of violence, the threats he had made to the victim, and the knife we had seen in his possession, he was the prime suspect. We must proceed with the interrogation of the suspect, but before we meet him, we try to eliminate all other possibilities. Because for this murder, we have no witnesses. You've got the victim who can't speak anymore, and then there's only the accused who can tell what really happened. So we eliminated all the possibilities that there could be anyone else who killed the victim.
Investigators, along with the prosecution, prepare to arrest the suspect.
We explain our evidence to him, and he confirms that we can make an arrest without a warrant. we have good reason to believe that he committed a crime. Once the entire investigation was finished, we had to seek assistance from 2 detectives from the provincial police who, in 2000, were specialists in video interrogation. So we had to prepare these 2 investigators, and once they had all the details of the file, we proceeded to the arrest.
On May 11th, 2001, more than a year after the investigation began, Jesse Barrowy is arrested for the murder of Tanya Pinette.
He had no reaction. We read him his right to silence and to an attorney, and he was transported to the Quebec Provincial Police offices for questioning. One of the investigators interrogates the suspect, and a backup investigator is outside and sees the whole interview and takes notes. And during the interrogation, there may be a change of investigator to continue the questioning. He sees only one investigator, but he knows that there's another investigator on the other side of the window watching him and taking notes.
Before the interview begins, Jesse is informed of his rights.
The interrogation lasted about 10 hours. And after that, the suspect sort of broke down. He asked to return to the interrogation room because he wanted to tell them what happened on the day of the murder. They cautioned him, saying, if you wish to tell me about the murder of the victim, you can, but you have the right to call your lawyer first. He said no. He didn't want to call his lawyer anymore. He wanted to recount what happened. He said they had visited the riverbank at the place where we found the heart that was carved in the tree. It was a place where they liked to be together because he was in love with her, he said. There, Jesse, the suspect, had a fit of jealousy. He accused the victim of being a prostitute. She wasn't having any of it. She tried to slap him, and he says they argued. To use his words, he freaked out. He opened the knife and stabbed her in the throat. Subsequently, he says the victim was crawling away and he left the scene. He never admitted pulling her into the river. He never tried to find out if she needed help, and he didn't want to explain more than that. He said it happened on the riverside where they swore their love to each other. It happened there. He said he left the scene and returned 2 days later to try to find a chain that he'd lost during the fight with the victim. He said he found the chain at the scene. If he hadn't returned, we would have found it because we had searched the riverbanks with a metal detector. He said he didn't see the body. The body must have been moved by the stream.
Following the confession, investigators have 24 hours to bring the accused before a judge.
The accused was taken to court the following day on the charge of second-degree murder. Because premeditation must be proven for first-degree murder, and in this case, there was no premeditation. There was no evidence to prove that. The suspect was indicted and pleaded guilty, and there was never a trial.
Jesse Barrowy receives a prison sentence of 11 years for the murder of Tanya Pinette. Water almost erased his crime, but thanks to the excellent work of the investigators, the murder was exposed and justice was served. source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. April 21st, 1999. A day that will be unlike any other for the small community of Lamont Bay. Located in the Charlevoix region of Quebec on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, this village will soon know the dark side. Our story begins just 100 kilometers south of Lamont Bay in the port of Quebec City. The oil drilling platform, Spirit of Columbus, is docked at the Davie Shipyard in the port of Quebec. Crews are making final preparations for its deployment on the high seas. Early in the day, a worker noticed something floating near the platform. It's a human body that is caught against the massive structure. The platform is only 30 meters from the harbor's entrance. The body is in danger of being swept away by the St. Lawrence River.
At the time, I was a homicide investigator with the crime unit at Sûreté de Quebec. At 7:30 a.m., a call was made at headquarters to report the body of a woman floating in the port of Quebec.
The first officers arrive on the scene at 8:05 a.m.
We look at the position of the body in the water and determine how we'll remove it. The decision to remove the body is made in consultation with the coroner and assisted by the drilling platform employees.
Once the body is taken out of the water, it is brought onto the dock and examined more closely. Forensics technician André Carigny photographs the body and the immediate scene.
The body was not decomposed. We could say that it had been in the water for perhaps 24 hours. From what we could see at first glance, there was nothing specific apart from some bruising. But there was nothing to say that the body had been in the water any longer than that.
Once the photography of the scene is completed, a preliminary examination of the body is conducted.
We realize that this is a woman in her 50s. She's dressed in sports clothing, she wears some jewelry, and her face is bruised and swollen. So we decide to take the body to the morgue in Quebec City, where we'll be able to examine it, note its condition, and search for any identification that can tell us who she is.
Once at the morgue, the coroner and Carigny conduct a detailed examination, taking care not to contaminate the remains in any way.
André Carigny examines the body and discovers some jewelry, like a watch, rings, and a Mazda keychain that comes from the Charlevoix dealership in Bay St. Paul.
All there is to identify this woman is a set of keys. This simple piece of evidence alone, however, is enough to get the Quebec police investigators started on the Police Information Center of Quebec database. This database is constantly being consulted and updated by all police forces in Quebec. Thousands of pieces of information are recorded each day, from a simple violation or missing persons to the most violent murders.
I ask our analyst, Daniel Hamel, to verify whether there are any matches in our system fitting the description of the person found, including her clothing, size, or facial appearance. Anything that would tie the body found in the port of Quebec to any of the missing persons listed in our system. And the result is negative. We are not able to identify the body. So in consultation with the coroner, we decide to send the body to the morgue in Montreal for an autopsy to be conducted the following day.
Montreal, April 22nd. The autopsy reveals an astonishing fact.
During the autopsy, we determined that the person has not been dead for long. We're talking about 24 to 48 hours maximum that the body could have been in the water. During the examination of the remains, the pathologist finds several bruises on the body, which indicates the victim was beaten before her death. As a result, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation. There are some obvious signs of breakage in the vertebrae and bones of the esophagus. So now we are definitely looking at a murder, and the victim is still unidentified.
Later that day, in the scenic community of Lamal Bay on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, the municipal police receive a call. The daughter of a resident asks to meet a police officer.
It was the beginning of my shift, a little after 4:30 p.m., when I went to the home to meet with 3 family members. They wanted to inform me of the disappearance of their mother, who was missing from home.
Officer Tremblay conducts a cursory search of Lucette Boilly's home, accompanied by one of her daughters.
I asked to look around the house, including the basement and the little garage, in order to find any clues. Perhaps there would be something that would explain the mother's disappearance.
Mrs. Boilly's agenda reveals she was to meet a certain Jacques Aimant the night before her disappearance. Lamal Bay is a small community, and Tremblay knows the man in question.
In the driveway of her home was a late-model Mazda Protégé 4-door sedan. Later, through the CRPQ Police Information Center database, I was able to confirm that the vehicle belonged to Mrs. Boilly.
Lucette Boilly's daughter explains to Tremblay that they found her mother's car at the St. Irénée Quay, a few kilometers from Lamal Bay, where she often went to walk. At about the same time in Quebec City, Sergeant Morrissey consults the CRPQ. Officer Tremblay's report immediately catches his attention. Could the body found in the port of Quebec be the missing woman from Lamal Bay? On the morning of April 21st, 1999, a group of workers found a woman dead in the port of Quebec. The Sûreté de Quebec officers find no identification on the victim's body. The autopsy reveals she had been strangled. The day after this discovery, a woman, Lucette Boilly, has been reported missing by her family from Lamal Bay, a small community in northern Quebec. Because of information found in Mrs. Boilly's agenda, Louis Tremblay is looking for Jacques Aimant, a person well known in the community of Lamal Bay.
Mr. Jacques Aimant, a resident of Charlevoix, late 30s, early 40s. He was a day laborer. He was known to us for what may be termed minor issues. Small cases of fraud and squabbles with neighbors and family.
Still looking for a missing person, Tremblay thinks that Aimant is probably the last person to have met Lucette Boilly the evening of April 20th.
I was patrolling the town. I saw Jacques Aimant sitting in his vehicle. He was on Saint-Étienne Street, facing the river. He was using binoculars to scan the bay. When I pulled up in my car on his left, he instinctively turned and quickly put the binoculars down. I told him that I wanted to talk to him, and he immediately replied, "We can talk here." I said, "Look, it's a park. It's 6 or 6:15 p.m. There are children everywhere. I'd rather you come to the office." And since we know each other, he didn't argue, and he said, well, okay, I'll follow you.
Tremblay, accompanied by Aimant, arrives at the Lamont Bay police station. They sit down for a chat.
I asked him if he knows the missing person, Lucette Boilly, to make sure I'm talking to the right guy and I'm heading in the right direction. And his answer is, yes, I know Lucette Boilly. And right away he fires back, but why? It came right away, his answer, why. I told him that as of today, Mrs. Boilly's children had reported their mother missing from her home, and that I was investigating her disappearance.
Aimant is tense, visibly nervous. Aimant said he had not seen Lucette Boilly for 3 weeks. Lucette is a massage therapist, and Tremblay knows from her agenda that Aimant is one of her clients.
He was getting a bit nervous. He told me, "You accuse me." It was strange how he said it. "You accuse me." Then I calmly reassured him, "I didn't say I accuse you. I need to know who you've seen these days because your name was mentioned to me by her children, and I am investigating."
The interview continues for 20 minutes, after which Officer Tremblay suspects that Jacques has not told him everything. Aimant's behavior suggests that there is something fishy. Tremblay continues to talk while walking Aimant to his car.
It's April 22nd, and he's wearing only a shirt and jeans. He's sweaty and out of breath. I asked him, "Why are you in that state?" And he replied, "It's because of the stairs." And then, right away, he says, "You're getting on my nerves."
Despite the cool, early spring weather, Aimant is bathed in sweat.
But I thought he had changed his behavior too fast. His body language changed. He was sweating profusely at 6 or 6:15, and he's not dressed appropriately. It's not that hot in Charlevoix on April 22nd.
Shortly before the end of his shift, Tremblay receives a call from an officer from Sûreté de Quebec District Headquarters in Quebec City. After consulting the Police Information Center of Quebec database, it seems there's a resemblance between two cases.
There was a considerable likeness with a body found the day before in the port of Quebec, a female body of about 55 or 60 years of age. They had found a clue on the body of the woman that could potentially lead to the identity of that missing person, a keychain with a key to a Mazda.
The next morning, Sergeant Morency's team from Quebec City visits Officer Tremblay to continue the investigation into the body found in the port of Quebec. Tremblay describes in detail his meeting with the family and especially his interview with Jacques Aimant. After the briefing, Officer Tremblay takes the investigators from the Sûreté de Quebec to meet the Boilly family. Morency wants to know if the body found in Quebec City is that of Lucette Boilly.
We parked in the victim's driveway. The victim's daughter was in the house, thinking that we were coming to give her details about her mother. We walked around looking at the vehicle and saw it was from Charlevoix Mazda. Richard Morency went ahead, knocked on the door while the forensic technician tried to unlock the trunk. The technician took the key, inserted it in the keyhole, turned it, and the trunk unlocked. As soon as the trunk opened, we knew we were definitely looking at a homicide. 100%.
We have a match that appears positive between the description we entered in the system and the description given by Officer Tremblay. I show Mrs. Boilly's daughter the jewelry and keychain that were found on her body. She confirms that the items indeed belong to her mother. Mrs. Lucette Boilly.
Interviews with the family confirmed Lucette Boilly did have an appointment with Jacques Aymon the night she disappeared. This contradicts Aymon's statement that he hadn't seen Lucette Boilly for 3 weeks. This, in addition to Aymon's apparent nervousness during the interview with Tremblay, compels Morency to take a closer look.
Donc, je rencontre la fille de Madame Boilly.
So I meet with Mrs. Boilly's daughter, and she shares some information. She tells me that on April 12th, she was taking a walk with her mother. And it was at this time her mother told her that recently a person she knew had given her an envelope that supposedly contained cash, worth at least $35,000. And why would Jacques Aymon give her this money? He told her that he had inherited this money, and it was causing problems in his relationship because his wife spends too much. And if she could help him with his problems, she would benefit from it. But he had told Mrs. Boilly not to open the envelope right away, but to wait for the next appointment. Unfortunately, Mrs. Boilly was curious, and she opened the envelope. There were no banknotes, but instead magazine clippings, cut the same size as banknotes.
This story of an inheritance and an envelope full of fake banknotes does not satisfy the investigators. Sergeant Morency has only the statements from the victim's daughter as an explanation, but the idea of fraud begins to take shape.
Lucette Boilly's daughter also tells me that shortly before her disappearance, on April 20th, her mother told her that she was going to the quay at Saint-Irénée to meet the individual who gave her the envelope. And Mrs. Boilly's daughter suggested to her that she not go to the meeting, that it's rubbish. You would be a fool to go to this meeting. He's crazy. Mrs. Boilly says, no, I'll go. I'm going to make myself happy and tell him he made fun of me and what he gave me was a joke.
Despite warnings from her daughter, on the evening of April 20th, the victim meets the suspect a few kilometers from La Malbaie at the Saint-Irénée quay.
We go to the quay at Saint-Irénée to talk to the neighbors who live close by. We're looking to identify any individuals who might have seen either Mrs. Boilly, Mr. Aymon, or their vehicles near the quay on April 20th. And we meet a resident whose home faces the quay, and she tells us that on that evening, she saw a car arrive at the quay, and shortly afterwards, another vehicle parked alongside it. The driver of one vehicle got into the passenger side of the other vehicle, and they drove away. She noted one particular fact, that the person who got into the passenger side of the other vehicle was wearing a yellow raincoat. And we know that her daughter confirmed that her mother had a yellow coat.
The accumulation of facts in this investigation leads police to start considering Jacques Aymon as their prime suspect.
Our concern is losing evidence that could be found in the suspect's vehicle.
On April 24th, Sergeant Morency obtains 2 search warrants. The first one for the suspect's car, a 4-door Oldsmobile, and the other for his house.
So on April 25th, after searching Mr. Aymon's home, they seize his vehicle and take it to the Sûreté de Quebec in La Malbaie, while the suspect is taken to headquarters in Quebec City for questioning.
Two other detectives are tasked with Aymon's interrogation. By law, they have the right to keep Aymon for 24 hours before pressing charges. Beyond that, they will have to let him go. Meanwhile, forensic technician André Carani begins examining Aymon's car at La Malbaie's SQ detachment.
We're looking for the relationship with the victim. Are there specific marks within the vehicle that can place her in this vehicle? That's what we're looking for. There are the suspect's fingerprints, but because it's his vehicle, his prints are of no value. The only thing that's important is to find a print that matches the victim. In this case, the vehicle had been dusted with black powder to search for fingerprints, or better yet, marks or traces of blood.
While Carani examines the vehicle, Emond is subjected to intense questioning at the SQ headquarters in Quebec City.
The interview with the suspect began around lunchtime. 3.5 hours later, we did what we call an alternation. That's to say that my partner took my place and I went into the control room to continue to monitor the progress of the interview. My partner worked with the individual for about an hour and a half. And we were increasingly convinced that we had a suspect and not simply a person who had a relationship to the victim.
As the interrogation progresses, they build their case and believe they have Lucette Boilly's killer in front of them.
When the questions were very, very incriminating, he refused to answer and finally asked to speak with a lawyer, which we granted. We ended the interview, and he was moved into a room where he was allowed to have a confidential conversation with his attorney. Subsequently, he was brought back into the room and the interrogation continued.
Meanwhile, in La Malbaie, Emond's Oldsmobile is proving a tough case to crack for seasoned technician André Carani. He decides to use a radical method. Is the beaten-up Oldsmobile hiding evidence of Lucette Boilly's murder? On April 21st, 1999, shipyard workers find the dead body of Lucette Boilly in the port of Quebec. The autopsy reveals that she had been strangled. An acquaintance, Jacques Emond, is the prime suspect. Investigators believe they have found their man. What remains to be found is the evidence to incriminate him. Forensic technician André Carani spends days examining evidence collected from Emond's home and his car. In fact, more than 100 different items have been collected, and all are subjected to systematic analysis.
In this vehicle, there were so many things: papers, bottles, cans of lubricant, Kleenex, even magazines. Throughout the vehicle, from the rear to the front seats, we identified all kinds of things.
Unfortunately, the efforts of André Carani did not produce any results. Ultimately, he decided to use a radical technique.
Cyanoacrylate is basically what is commonly called crazy glue. And when you heat it, the vapors from cyanoacrylate will produce a certain degree of humidity and adhere to the fingerprints. Except that in order to be able to see the fingerprints, we need to add a liquid, a bright liquid that is luminescent. This allows us to use a polylight or a laser to reveal the print and to be able to photograph it more easily.
But the cyanoacrylate causes a lot of damage in the vehicle. Once the examination is completed, the car is often found irreparably damaged. When a vehicle is destroyed this way, the Quebec police are obligated to reimburse the owner for the value of the vehicle. But when it comes to finding evidence that could convict a murderer, it's a risk that has to be taken. Despite all the resources and efforts on these examinations, Carani does not produce any evidence that incriminates Jacques Emond. The interrogation of Aimant at the SQ headquarters in Quebec also reveals nothing new. After 10 hours of questioning, investigators come to an impasse.
At some point during the interrogation, he started to cry, and we saw that he was under a lot of pressure, but it was the pressure of living with what he had done. But there was no confession. At the time, we only had our opinion and what we call an investigative hunch.
Aimant is on the verge of exhaustion. He closes up and becomes silent. Morency is concerned that further examination could be perceived by a jury as harassment. They decide to release the suspect. Aimant's reaction is amazing. In the blink of an eye, his behavior is transformed as he sees some light at the end of the tunnel. Detective Lamontagne is so surprised by this change that he could not resist a parting remark to Aimant as he leaves.
He was clearly advised that we knew he was involved in the victim's death and that we had respected his rights, but now we would continue our investigation and we would certainly see him again.
The release of Aimant without a confession means that investigators have to pursue other avenues. In the following days, dozens of witnesses are interviewed.
C'est ainsi qu'on apprend que M. Aimant, c'est un fraudeur.
So we learned that Mr. Aimant is a fraudster. He has manipulated several people in the town of La Malbaie and the surrounding area. The story that he uses most often, that we heard most often, is that he mentioned to people that he invested in pharmaceuticals and it made him a lot of money. And like any good fraudster, he was able to convince people to invest in his company without a prospectus, with nothing, just by his convincing words.
Sergeant Morency decides to examine Lucette Boilly's bank statements, looking for significant transactions between Lucette and Aimant. His working hypothesis is that Mrs. Boilly is the victim of a scam gone wrong.
We found two other witnesses who also mentioned that they had invested a certain sum of money in a fake pharmaceutical company on the advice of Jacques Aimant. Months passed, and then at some point, one of these people met Jacques Aimant and said, "Listen, I want you to give me my money back." And Jacques Aimant was angry at this individual. He grabbed him by the throat and said, "Don't speak to me ever again about that money." And we know from the pathologist that Mrs. Boilly was forcibly strangled.
Aimant's tactics work. Fearing reprisals, the two men kiss their investments goodbye. Morency decides to investigate another hypothesis that could explain the discovery of the body in the port of Quebec. He thinks that maybe Aimant killed Boilly near La Malbaie and threw the body into the St. Lawrence River, and the currents carried the body to Quebec City. For expert advice, Morency calls on the Canadian Coast Guard based in Quebec City. Hubert Desgagnés at the Marine Rescue Center is responsible for assisting the SQ in this query.
The answer was obvious. It was impossible, because the current in the river is always strongest as it gets to its mouth. Even when there are tides in the area, the current does not go back upstream as far as it goes downstream towards the mouth. But the police always want a more technical explanation, one that could convince a judge or a coroner beyond any doubt, and explain that it's impossible for a body to drift upstream. And we were asked to create a scenario to assess drift and where the body would have been thrown into the river in order to end up where it was discovered.
The Canadian Coast Guard uses CANSARP software that takes advantage of multiple databases to project the drift of an object in a body of water.
The river has its own current that varies with the normal flow of the season. And the wind data from Environment Canada can add to or subtract from the current according to the wind direction and the wind strength. Therefore, an additional constant that can affect the end result. And it can result for a given incident that a body or an object would end up 2, 6, or 12 miles further, depending on the scenario.
Very quickly, they realized the St. Lawrence River has no secret current that could bring Lucette Boilly's body back to Quebec City in a few hours. Quite the contrary.
We simply input the currents, tides, and everything pointed towards an approximate drift more or less towards the region of Rimouski. So, the complete opposite direction of Quebec City.
De Gagnet's expertise suggests that Boilly's body was found in the port of Quebec because that's where it entered the water. Meanwhile, Sergeant Morrissey goes forward with the suspected fraud involving Aimant and Lucette Boilly. They obtain Lucette's bank statements. They don't reveal transactions between the victim and the suspect. On the other hand, the police discover some amazing information.
We noticed that the same day we discovered the body of the victim in the port of Quebec, that there were 3 transactions completed using the victim's ATM card. The first transaction at around 8 in the morning at the restaurant Le Petit Régal in Bay St. Paul, and then 2 ATM cash withdrawals at the National Bank in Beaupré.
Lucette's family told the police that their mother has only 1 debit card and she always kept it in her wallet.
An interesting note is that Mrs. Boilly wrote down her debit card's PIN number on a piece of paper that she left in her purse with her ATM card.
Sergeant Morrissey sends investigators to the restaurant in Bay St. Paul and to the bank in Beaupré. This is finally a solid clue that could lead directly to the killer.
So we headed to the restaurant, Le Petit Régal in Bay St. Paul, to try to identify regular customers. We met with several of the customers, and they tell us that, yes, that morning they saw a couple arrive who are not the usual breakfast customers. They described the man in question as tall, stocky, with a 4-door Oldsmobile, and he also had a lady that accompanied him. This is confirmed by several customers.
The police are using a photo of Aimant to show customers at the Petit Régal. The picture was taken during a prior arrest for domestic violence in Lamont Bay.
We had to take an old photo from the Malbaie Police Archives. While not 100% certain that it is the person they saw at the restaurant on the morning of April 21st, most witnesses told us that this photo looks like the person they saw that morning at Petit Régal, and that he was not a regular breakfast customer.
It is impossible for the customers at the restaurant to confirm the identity of Aimant from an old photo. Sergeant Morrissey asks a judge for a special warrant.
I met with the prosecuting attorney to obtain warrants requiring the suspect and his wife to come to the police station to have their photos taken. Then we were able to create a new photo lineup. We returned to see the restaurant customers with the new photos in order to obtain a positive identification of Mr. Aimant this time.
15 days after the body is discovered, Aimant and his wife are served with the warrant and appear at the Lamont Bay SQ office. Will Sergeant Morrissey get a positive ID of Aimant from a new photo of his #1 suspect? On April 21st, 1999, a woman is found dead in the port of Quebec. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled. Her name is Lucette Boilly. The number one suspect is Jacques Aymon. He is an acquaintance of the victim and a notorious fraudster. He is questioned at length. The police learn that the victim's bank card was used after her death. In retracing where the card was used, they are trying to confirm that Aymon was the one who used it. Aymon and his wife are brought to Lamont Bay SQ detachment for a photo session. While the forensic technicians proceed to photograph Aymon, in another room, Sergeant Morency questions Aymon's wife.
Did she remember what she had done with her husband on April 21st? She said yes. She said, April 21st, I went with Jacques. We left very early in the morning. We headed to Bay St. Paul. We stopped at the restaurant Le Petit Régal for breakfast, and it was Jacques who paid the bill. Then she says they were headed to Beaupré, where they stopped in a small shopping center, and her husband told her he had to make a phone call. She identifies the corner of the mall where he entered, which corresponds with the entrance to the ATM.
Finally, the police have enough evidence to arrest Aymon for murder. Once again, investigators interrogate Aymon at the SQ headquarters. They tell him about the statements made by his wife.
He first wanted to talk to his wife. We said he could not talk to her, but he was shown the statement she had given us. After he learned of this statement, he knelt down in the interview room and then he asked for forgiveness. And he asked to see a priest. We explained that it was not procedure, and then he quietly confessed. The suspect gave us a version of the events in which he confirmed what we already thought. That is to say, he was directly involved in the death of the victim, the crime had occurred in the Lamel Bay region, and that afterward he had transported the body to Quebec City, where he had thrown it in the old port.
Following Aymon's confession, Sergeant Morency accompanies him for a show and tell, a common procedure in the case of confessions. They retrace the journey between the murder scene and the port of Quebec. First, they go to Cap aux Oies, a few miles from Lamont Bay, where Aymon admits to strangling Lucette Boilly.
Nous arrêtons dans un premier temps au provisoire de Beaupré.
First, we stop at a convenience store in Beaupré, which is where Jacques Aymon says he threw the victim's yellow coat and her purse into the garbage. Then we head to the beach at Cap aux Oies. And then Jacques Aymon identifies the place where he says he fell with Lucette Boilly. He says that the fall ultimately caused her death. A particular fact when he tells us where he had struggled with the victim Jacques Aymon becomes ill and vomits at the exact place where he says he killed Lucette Boilly.
The confessions of Aymon, combined with the evidence gathered during the investigation, enables Sergeant Morency to reconstruct the events of that tragic day.
Then he says he parked his car. And he walked along the beach, thinking about what he would do. He traveled from Cap aux Oies to the quay at Bay St. Paul, with the deceased sitting in the right front seat with her seatbelt on so she wouldn't fall. This is when he decides to put the body in the trunk of the car. So he leaves the quay at Bay St. Paul with the body in the trunk and heads for Quebec City. He enters the port of Quebec and travels along the wharf, not far from where the drilling platform, the Spirit of Columbus, is being repaired. He throws the body into the water and returns to Bay St. Paul.
With Amon's confession, the police have been able to trace with reasonable accuracy his comings and goings after he got rid of the body.
In the morning, Amon returned to La Malbaie. He completely washed out his car at 6 in the morning. So he vacuumed the car and washed it inside and out. So we went to see the neighbors to ask if they had seen Jacques Amon clean his vehicle that morning. But there was no one who saw Jacques Amon clean his car at that time. It may also explain why there was no evidence in the car when we did our search, because Jacques Amon took care to clean the evidence out of his car.
De tout nettoyer son véhicule.
After a restless night, Amon returns to Quebec for breakfast and a shopping trip with his wife. That's when he uses the bank card, which in the end leads to his conviction. The trial begins and Amon is charged with first-degree murder. He is convicted and receives a life sentence with eligibility for parole after 12 years. But Amon's lawyer claims that the confessions from him and his wife were obtained illegally. Amon is released on bail while the case is appealed. Could illegality see Amon escape his punishment? In late April 1999, a dead woman was removed from the waters of the port of Quebec. The autopsy revealed that she had been strangled. The investigation finds her name is Lucette Boilly and was reported missing from her home in La Malbaie. Jacques Amon, an acquaintance of the victim and a notorious fraudster, is the #1 suspect. Investigators discovered that the victim's bank card was used after her death. Unsuspectingly, Amon's wife confirms that he used the bank. Amon is tried and found guilty of murder. His lawyer appeals the verdict, and in a last-minute turnaround, Amon is granted bail pending a new trial. Amon breached his parole by committing a petty crime. This time, the sentence facing Amon is 25 years in prison. Because he violated the conditions of his bail, he is found guilty and incarcerated at Orsonville in the Quebec City suburbs. Consumed by the thought that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, on October 30th, 2000, Jacques Amon hangs himself in his cell.
We cannot confirm beyond a doubt what Amon's motive was. On the other hand, with the information obtained from the witnesses, we strongly believe that the motive was fraud. We believe that the evening Mrs. Boilly formally advised Jacques Amon that his little scam was over and that she wanted her money back. Jacques Amon may have gotten angry, as he had become angry with other investors who wanted their money back.
When he threw the lifeless body of Lucette Boilly into the port of Quebec, Jacques Amon believed the mighty St. Lawrence River would carry his victim out to sea. The currents and tides would be the perfect accomplice. He trusted that water would keep his murderous secret forever. But Jacques Amon was dead wrong. source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. Summer 2001. The national capital of Quebecers vibrates to the strains of an idyllic late summer. The buskers make their final laps. The crowd enjoys the final chords of major public concerts. Fall is knocking at the door. On the morning of August 22nd, Quebec City comes out of its summer euphoria by the discovery of a body on the banks of the St. Charles River. Sergeant Detective Sylvain Tremblay of the Quebec City Police is assigned to the case.
We received a call at our offices around 1 in the afternoon that an individual had been found in the St. Charles River. There was a lot of blood at the scene, and it seemed very suspicious. The Forensic Identification Unit was called to the crime scene to assess everything from the beginning. That's the first job of an investigator, to determine whether in fact it's a murder or an accident, or if it's a suicide.
The Forensic Identification Unit marks a large crime scene. They methodically work their investigation inward toward the body. The evidence found in the area immediately indicates to investigators that this is most likely a violent crime.
When we arrived, we expanded the crime scene because it was obvious that it was a homicide, and in fact, the first crime scene was the upper level where we could see that there had been a fight because there were bloodstains on the ground. And then we had the second part of the scene, which was the lower level where the victim fell. In fact, we could see that the second crime scene continued down because at the bottom there was a pool of blood much larger than on the upper level, as if someone had bled profusely at that spot. And the third crime scene was where the body was found in the water by the wall that runs alongside the river. So there was the upper crime scene, the lower crime scene, and then the scene where the body was found. The main things we found were traces of blood from which several samples were taken, and then we found two types of pills. The pills were integral to the crime scene because they were found with the blood. And then several other things were recovered, such as cigarette butts and beer cans, which we sent for analysis to try and determine the DNA.
The investigation is moving at a good pace, but the work of Detective Sergeant Tremblay will soon get complicated.
I would say that after an hour of being at the scene, we received a phone call at the station informing us that on the other side of the river, there was something resembling the canvas or a kind of tarp that was near the body. So we moved. We went to the other side of the river and marked a perimeter around that area. We could tell right away that the tarp we found at the original crime scene was 99% likely to have come from the tarp on the north side of the river because of the cut marks on it. You could see, even without an exhaustive analysis, that the first piece found with the body was probably cut from the second piece of tarp. No one knew why we had a piece that was on one side and then another piece that was on the other side.
Meanwhile, the corpse covered with a blanket still lies on the edge of the St. Charles River.
I went down with the forensic identification technician to take photos and to search the pockets of the individual because he had not been identified. We could already see that he had facial injuries. We searched the body where it lay on the riverbed, and the only thing that was found on the young person's pockets was a ticket to Expo, Quebec. It was the only thing he had on him. No identification, no money.
Expo Quebec is the annual fair that takes place every August in the popular Vanier district near the Quebec Coliseum. Police notice that the body has not been carried away by the St. Charles River. In addition, they notice the water level is unusually low.
The city of Quebec had decided to lower the St. Charles River at night, but exactly when the body was uncovered by the water, when the water receded completely, we don't know. All we know is that two pedestrians passing by the area at around 12:30, 12:40 p.m. spotted the body. The body had certainly been in the water for at least 12 hours, but how long it had been uncovered, we didn't know.
Detective Sergeant Tremblay thinks the body did not drift after it fell into the water.
The body was found exactly in line with the bloodstains and the pills. We could see that it hadn't floated a bit. It really stayed there where it had fallen. The water level was perhaps already just 2 feet or so, and the body stayed anchored in the mud. The victim was very dirty because the river was quite polluted, and when the water level went down, it left a lot of black marks on the body. His shirt was almost torn from his body. It was held on only by one sleeve. We could see that he was very thin, not very tall, but we thought he was about 20, 22 years old.
The investigation soon reveals that Quebec City has drained the river to conduct major development work on the banks of the St. Charles River.
When we started the shoreline naturalization project and river cleanup, it was conducted over a period of nearly 4 years, particularly in summer, when we could voluntarily lower the level of the river by opening the Samson Dam gates.
The water level of the St. Charles River is controlled by a dam located downstream from the crime scene. The Samson Dam maintains a constant water level in the river and ensures a minimum water supply to a paper mill located downstream. When the river flow is reduced by the electric gates, the impact on the flow is considerable.
The effects were felt almost 5 kilometers away. With the slope of the riverbed, certain parts of the river went from being 40 to 50 meters wide to 10 meters wide, and with only a few feet of water at the bottom of the river.
Hubert de Gagné is a former member of the Canadian Coast Guard Marine Rescue Unit based in Quebec City. He knows the St. Charles River intimately.
As a rule, when there is a drowning, the body sinks at the spot where the drowning occurred, and we must wait until the natural decomposition process does its work and the body resurfaces. During the summer in Quebec, the river can easily reach 22, 23 degrees. It depends if the summer is very hot. If so, the decomposition process will be very fast, which means that after 3 days, the body may resurface. Unlike during the spring, when it can easily take 7 or 8 days before the body floats to the surface. So that's the difference we can denote. And once it's on the surface, yes, it will drift, but the velocity of the current is practically zero. The body can easily stay in one place for several hours, even a day or two, or drift several hundred meters in a day, depending on the time of year and what's happening with the dam.
The investigation uncovers 2 important facts. First, the river flow, even with the help of the Samson Dam, was too slow to carry the body. Secondly, the draining process explains how the body remained on the bank. But as he prepares to move the body to the morgue, Detective Sergeant Tremblay receives a new piece of information.
I received a phone call informing me that minutes earlier a youth had been reported missing to the Haute St. Charles Municipal Police, and that there's a possibility that it is our victim. The Haute St. Charles Municipal Police looked into it and gave us a description. It seemed that it was probably the young man we had found because of the description of his clothing, especially his shirt. From there, we believed that it corresponded to the mother's call about her missing son.
Even though they have a description of the body found in the St. Charles River, the identity must be confirmed. Could the body lying on the muddy river bank be the missing person? On August 22, 2001, beside the tranquil St. Charles River in Old Quebec, the corpse of a young man without identification is found. Investigators immediately suspect it to be a murder. The crime scene is spread out over 3 levels along the river and is stained with blood, evidence of a violent death. The security perimeter is very broad, encompassing areas on both banks of the St. Charles. While moving the victim to the morgue, Sylvain Tremblay receives a call about a missing person that could solve the identity of the young man. Tremblay investigates.
Another investigator and I went to meet the parents of the victim in the afternoon. And everything was consistent with the description, especially the clothing.
The victim is formally identified as Charles Tremblay, barely 15 years old.
From the moment we're sure of the identity, we start checking the last 24 hours of the victim's life to reconstruct what happened. His mother told us that the day before she had dropped her son off at Expo Quebec, and she had not heard from him since. So after the family, the next people we met with were the 2 friends that accompanied the victim to Expo Quebec.
Both of Charles' friends are also 15 years old. The police quickly notice that their versions of events are inconsistent.
The 2 young men that we met with in the afternoon or early evening initially gave us a misleading version of what had happened because they wanted to hide the fact that they went to Youville Square to purchase narcotics.
The 2 teenagers awkwardly try to cover up their actions, but the investigators are not easily fooled.
It was a very simple explanation. We had doubts, though, because there were parts of the story where they contradicted one another, about where Charles had gone and what time they had last seen him. It was during discussions with the mother that we learned we were missing pieces of the story from the versions his 2 friends had given us.
In fact, the evening at Expo Quebec had gone quite differently. Through a friend of the teenagers, Charles' mother learns what really took place and informs investigators.
In fact, this friend of the victim had spoken with one of the youths who had gone to Expo Quebec, and he said that they had gone to Youville Square and had lost track of Charles there.
This new information surprised the police because Youville Square is several kilometers from where Charles' body was found. Located in the heart of the Latin Quarter, Youville Square is a focal point during the beautiful summer days. A hub for major cultural events, it is also a meeting place for motley youth in search of cheap thrills.
We talked to his friends again and explained the seriousness of things, that we were investigating a murder and that it was important to have the truth, even if they're youths. This often happens during questioning where there's a connection to drugs. People try to conceal it and manipulate the truth a bit.
The teens' new version of what happened reveals circumstances far different from their first description.
The fact is that they had spent the afternoon at Expo Quebec with Charles, And at about 6 p.m., they went to Youville Square to buy some PCP.
PCP was very popular in Quebec at the time of the crime. It is a synthetic drug that comes in the form of crystalline powder. It is usually added to tobacco or marijuana and inhaled with the smoke. Its effects are similar to that of hallucinogens or narcotics. Once at Youville Square, the three teenagers try to locate a drug dealer.
There, they met with someone they knew who would introduce them to another person who would sell them the PCP. Charles had the other team's money to buy the drugs, and he left with the drug dealer. And that was the last time his friends saw him.
At this point, it's almost 8 p.m. The two teens tell the police that they waited a long time for Charles.
They waited for at least 2 or 3 hours at Youville Square, but Charles never came back. And then they took a bus and just went home.
The small-time drug dealers at Youville Square are well known to the police. Officers went to the site with the intent to track down the dealer the three youths met with.
We had an accurate description of the person they knew. His nickname was Beef. And then we also had a good description of the PCP dealer that Beef had introduced them to. It was a pretty specific description because the suspect had a mohawk that was bleached, a little yellow, whitish yellow, and he had a barbell piercing between his eyes with a pin here and 2 balls there, so it was a rather specific description. The guy with the nickname Beef was well known to police. They were able to find him right away. The officers began to question him about the events, and he pointed out the suspect in question, who was also at Youville Square. And then Beef told the police that our suspect was the guy he had set the 3 boys up with to buy PCP.
The individual in question no longer has his famous mohawk. He shaved it off the previous night, but Beef has no trouble identifying him to the police.
Naturally, there were no grounds for arrest. He was very drunk and refused to identify himself, refused to cooperate.
Police officers try to question the individual, but he refuses, and the situation degenerates rapidly.
Severe enough that he started to fight.
The individual in question is struggling to the point that investigators have to use pepper spray to subdue him. Finally, he is put under arrest for public drunkenness and refusing to identify himself. Once at the station, police obtain a positive identification of the individual. He is John Rene Cyr, a character well known to the police with a long record. He is so intoxicated that investigators wait until the next day to question him.
We interviewed the individual for a long time without succeeding in obtaining an incriminating statement from him. But it became clear that he was a prime suspect because from the answers he gave, we saw he was hiding important details. He had in fact changed his looks. He had cut his mohawk and he had removed the barbell that he had in between his eyes. And the information we received was that during the day, in a Youville Square restaurant washroom, he shaved off his mohawk. Now that was suspicious behavior. He registered with Allostop for a ride to Saguenay, For us, that was suspicious behavior because he wanted to flee and he changed his appearance.
Although several statements seem to be incriminating, the questioning of Cyr reveals nothing else. Legally, the Quebec police can hold Cyr in custody for 24 hours. After that period, if he hasn't been charged, he must be released. Sergeant Detective Tremblay has discovered another reason to keep Cyr in custody while they gather more evidence. Will this prove his role in the murder of Charles? On August 22, 2001, the unidentified body of a young man is discovered. The evidence points directly to a murder. The investigation reveals the victim is Charles Tremblay, 15. The police learned that the previous night, Tremblay went to Youville Square to purchase PCP. There he was introduced to a known drug dealer, Jean-René Cyr. Cyr was apprehended, but police don't have sufficient evidence to charge him with Tremblay's murder. Since Sergeant Detective Tremblay suspects Cyr's involvement in the death of young Charles, he searches for grounds to keep Cyr in custody. As always in such cases, a thorough investigation into Cyr's background is conducted.
2 or 3 weeks before the event, the ex-girlfriend of the suspect had brought a complaint of burglary against him after an argument. She had kicked him out of her apartment, and then a couple of days after that, the suspect had entered through a window while she was in the apartment. He had made death threats to his ex-girlfriend. All of this put together meant we could keep him in custody while we continue our investigation and accumulate evidence to build a case against him later. In fact, this is what allowed us to hold him for a month.
Meanwhile, the autopsy results for Charles Tremblay confirm what police already know.
An investigator attended the autopsy in Montreal and came back with something to the effect that the youth's root cause of death was drowning. But he also gave us a little description of his injuries, including a fractured skull, which was very important.
Investigators believe that the skull fractures Charles sustained can be explained because of the height of a concrete wall that separates the two levels of the crime scene. Charles would have fallen or been thrown over this wall.
The pathologist could not formally comment on that aspect, on whether he would have died of the skull fracture or whether he would have survived. But of course, if he'd had immediate care, if he had been taken to a hospital, it's hard to say, but the official cause of death was drowning because his lungs were filled with water.
The day after the discovery of Charles' body, investigators received more important information. A backpack was found on the shore, opposite the crime scene.
There was an individual who found a backpack with a cell phone inside, and when he heard about the crime on the news, he called to let us know. The backpack actually did belong to the victim. We immediately had it identified by the parents of the victim, who, like any parent, knew their son's backpack pretty well. And in fact, it confirmed that something had also happened on the other side of the river. We now had the piece of tarp and the backpack with the cell phone in it, both of which were found on the other side of the river. The cell phone belonged to Mr. Bouchard, who had already reported his cell as stolen, and he suggested that possibly it was the suspect in our case who had taken it, because the day before the murder, the suspect was at Mr. Bouchard's home.
Investigators discover that Cyr has a particular obsession that could connect him to other crimes.
Throughout the investigation, we discovered, because several people informed us of it, that he had a habit of grabbing cell phones that were lying around anywhere. I don't know if he felt important that way, but he often had 2 phones on him. Like when we arrested him, he had 2 cell phones on him, which didn't belong to him. He used to collect cells and then sell them or make them disappear. The cell became an important piece of circumstantial evidence because we were actually able to connect the victim's backpack to the suspect because of the cell phone.
Armed with a photo of Jean-René Cyr from his recent arrest, without his famous mohawk, the police ask their key witnesses, the two friends of Charles, if they can identify the suspect.
Charles's two friends clearly identified this individual as the one who had left Youville Square with the victim. And then we learned that this person, the suspect, lived at the Salvation Army.
Investigators visit the Salvation Army shelter in Aubé River, Quebec. The first person they speak with is Louis Vizina. He is very cooperative.
Mr. Vizina informed us that on the night of the murder, another resident of the Salvation Army, Mr. English, told him that something serious had happened. He did not give details, but he was with Jean-René Cyr, and something serious had happened. He was almost in a state of shock.
With the statement from Vizina, investigators finally have a more serious lead.
Mr. Louis Vizina brought a lot of elements to the investigation. The pills that were found at the scene were important because we were able to link this kind of medication to the suspect. A day or two before, the suspect had the same pills to sell. They call these peanuts, for $5 a piece at Youville Square. We could identify these pills as Rivotril and Deceit, the two drugs in question.
Rivotril is an anticonvulsant and anxiolytic commonly prescribed to treat epilepsy. Deceit is an antidepressant.
Naturally, we had to wait to receive the official results of the analysis, but you could already tell that the pills matched the ones stolen from Mr. Vizina by the suspect. So it became an important piece of circumstantial evidence because, again, it was linked to the suspect.
A search of Cyr's room at the Salvation Army reveals some interesting evidence that might place him at one of the crime scenes.
We found his tent hung up to dry. We could see that there was a small tent that had been used. And this was the only thing we found in his room that could corroborate part of that story, actually. Later we learned that the suspect had a habit of camping on the banks of the St. Charles River. This was corroborating that part of the story. It's information we had received from his ex-girlfriend.
But Vizina's statement is particularly useful because it puts the police on the trail of Danny English. He told Vizina that he had witnessed something serious with Jean-René Cyr. English is known to police and hangs out at Youville Square. Detective Doris Paget conducts the interrogation.
When we met with Mr. Danny English at the home of his girlfriend, he was not intoxicated. He was lucid and seemed normal. However, Mr. Louis Vizina told us that when they met at the Salvation Army shelter, English was intoxicated, and he was stressed by what had just happened.
Detective Paget thinks Danny English could be the only eyewitness to the murder of Charles Tremblay. But his level of intoxication the night of the events was such that Paget has a difficult time piecing events together. To top it off, English fears a reprisal from Cyr if he talks to the police.
It took some time before he started to explain that he was with the suspect, Jean-René Cyr, and a young man. He told us that he was extremely intoxicated and that the suspect, Mr. Cyr, supplied him with pills.
English tells Detective Paget how he joined Jean-René Cyr and Charles Tremblay when leaving Youville Square.
So the three of them walked together. He said he had difficulty remembering some moments, However, he described the route they took, which ran along the St. Charles River in Quebec City.
Despite his confused memory, English reveals how the events took a sinister turn.
Indeed, there was a negotiation in connection with the purchase of narcotics. They began to argue because Jean-René Cyr had changed the price from what he told the victim earlier. He described that the suspect was not satisfied with the negotiation, the amount of money that the young man was trying to offer. In Mr. English's words, Jean-René Cyr got very angry. So at some point, the suspect took the victim by the throat and was punching the victim, who ended up on the ground. Then Mr. English witnessed the victim being dragged, and then the suspect picked him up and threw him over the wall to the lower level. The suspect then kicked him, and then picked him up again and threw the body over the wall on the edge of the St. Charles River. And then Mr. English decided to run away. So essentially, it was a deal that went wrong. That's the motive in this crime. And according to Mr. Danny English, the victim was unconscious when he was thrown over the guardrail. This is basically what he said in his statement. We could also tell that he seemed afraid of the consequences of his statement.
Danny English proves to be a key witness. For the first time, police have a plausible explanation for what happened to Charles Tremblay, from the time he left the Youville Square until his tragic end.
We made a written statement, something we call an affidavit. It's a statement which is sworn before a commissioner for oaths, or when possible, before a justice of the peace. And once accepted, it has the same value as a testimony in court. So this is what we did, a written statement.
Investigators have significant circumstantial evidence and a signed affidavit from Danny English. They are waiting for the results from the blood analysis taken from the 2 pieces of tarp found at the scene. This latest evidence could seal the fate of the suspect, Jean-René Cyr.
We could not say whether the blood was there before or after the event, except that following the arrest, we had witnesses that told us that the suspect had injured knuckles the day after the event. So it was possible that the injuries occurred the evening of the crime, or perhaps as long as a week earlier. Therefore, if the blood had been on the tarp for a week, that still put our suspect at the crime scene.
The result of the comparison from the 2 tarp segments proves that the blood was from the same person.
Well, if we find that it is his blood on the tarp, there has to be a reason why we found this piece of tarp with his blood on it at the scene of the crime. Moreover, the victim that we found had left Youville Square with him on the previous night.
Only DNA analysis can determine beyond a reasonable doubt if it is the blood of Jean-René Cyr or that of Charles Tremblay. Will all this circumstantial evidence be sufficient to convince a jury? Will the blood-stained tarp found near the body of Charles reveal Cyr's secret? Will Sergeant Detective Tremblay's team be able to solve the case with just a few drops of blood? On August 22, 2001, the body of a young man, Charles Tremblay, was found on the banks of the St. Charles River. The discovery coincided with a riverbank restoration project carried out by the city of Quebec. An important witness, Danny English, is identified and interviewed. The police learned that the night before, Tremblay went to the St. Charles River with a man named Jean-René Cyr. When English last saw the victim, Cyr was beating him mercilessly. The young Tremblay was never seen alive again. For investigators, the cause of the fight that led to the murder remains a mystery.
He beat him, choked him, kicked him, punched him, and threw him over the edge to the lower level. Actually, we can't say if he was thrown down there or if he fell down.
Aside from Sear's brutal temperament, the police never managed to establish the motive for his actions.
It's frustrating. I mean, there's a railing about 4 feet tall. If the young man fell down there, it's because really he was pushed. And immediately after the victim fell, because it looked like a fall, the suspect walks down, goes around, because they weren't stairs, it's sort of a ramp for bicycles. So he must have walked at least 60 or 70 feet, about 30 yards, before reaching the body. And then after that, throwing him into the water. But it's in his madness, in his violence, that all this happened. We can't say if he intended to kill him, but you can't not have the intention if you do that. Throwing someone unconscious into the water, it's certain he will die.
Investigators use traces of blood left at the scene of another crime where Sear is a suspect. While breaking into his ex-girlfriend's apartment, Sear had cut himself on glass, leaving behind a valuable source of DNA. The police laboratory compares this sample with the blood on the tarp in order to charge Sear. But in 2001, DNA analysis was not as advanced as it is today.
Oh, it was quite long. I would say it took 3 weeks before we had DNA results, because this was back in 2001, so analyses took longer. And I know we pressured the laboratory because it was important. Of course, we were waiting for this. It was the icing on the cake that allowed us to accuse our suspect.
The lab results prove all 3 blood samples match. The investigation gains momentum.
The same day we received the DNA results, the prosecutor gave us the okay to press charges. It was very important indeed. Everything played off that analysis. It allowed us to place him at the scene, which is in fact the main evidence in the case, the suspect's DNA at the crime scene. So you could say these are all pieces of a puzzle. When you put them all together, it becomes obvious why our suspect is the one we arrested and charged in this case.
Even though all the crime scene blood samples match, the 2 on the pieces of tarp and the 1 on the broken window, Sergeant Detective Tremblay wants to avoid any doubt about his DNA evidence.
From the moment we had the results from the laboratory, we asked for a new warrant to collect a blood sample for the suspect's DNA. A technician actually went to the detention center and took a blood sample from Sear, and that was returned to the laboratory. But this time it was very quick to make the match. There was no doubt at that moment about the identity of the suspect.
From that moment on, the wheels of justice begin to turn. But the trial immediately hits an unforeseen roadblock.
After 2 weeks of procedures during the first trial, one of the jury members claimed to have received threats in a shopping center in Quebec, which meant the trial was aborted.
As the trial against Sear begins, it is immediately derailed. Will Sear's lawyer asked to dismiss the charges against his client. The body of 15-year-old Charles Tremblay is found on the drained bank of the St. Charles River. The police learn that the night before, Tremblay is seen with Jean-René Sear, a man with a penchant for violence. The investigation compares blood samples from 2 crime scenes to prove that Sear is the murderer. The first trial is aborted after alleged threats to a jury member.
But in fact, it was not true. It was invented by the jury member who was then charged with obstruction of justice.
A new trial is scheduled with a new jury. But even then, the prosecution suffers another setback.
Danny English did an about-face, if I can use that expression. He completely changed his story. He came to court and said that the police had forced him to write that statement. Danny English definitely knew the suspect. He knew he was a very violent individual. He was afraid to testify against the suspect. That's what caused him to be uncooperative and unwilling to work with the police.
The prosecution tries to discredit English's new version of events. The court even allows the prosecutor to deal with him as a hostile witness, even though he was the prosecution's own star witness.
The jury did not believe his new story or his new attitude. It was not accepted. In the end, what he had written was taken as evidence, even though he claimed in the second trial that it was all false and untrue.
In the end, despite the extreme violence of the crime, the police are stunned with the sentence.
In fact, what led to the charge of second-degree murder being accepted was the fact that the victim died by drowning. During the altercation, the victim was severely beaten. We can't know for sure whether after the fall he would have died. This would have been manslaughter because if a person falls and dies in a fight, we can't assume the other person intended to kill him. But the fact that the suspect went down to the lower level to pick up the body, which we can think of as 99% inanimate at the time, and then threw him into the river, means he really intended to kill him. Because throwing a person who is unconscious into the water, naturally there's a 100% chance he will drown there.
One of the incriminating elements was a simple piece of tarp that the accused left near the dead body of the young Charles Tremblay. One piece of tarp stained with the blood from the murderer.
The most likely hypothesis is that after the event, after the murder, the suspect left the scene with the victim's backpack and then proceeded to cross to the north side of the river. He went past the Laurentian Highway, he headed along the north side, and then he left the backpack and the cell phone on the promenade on the north side. And then he went to camp out on the piece of tarp. And naturally, when he awoke in the morning, he saw that the river had dropped and that the body was visible. The hypothesis is that he decided to cut off a piece of the tarp to cover the body so that nobody would see it. But when he got to the crime scene, there were already people out walking, so he simply abandoned the tarp. This is what we felt was most plausible. That must be why he returned to the scene with a piece of tarp to try and throw it on the body so that nobody would see it. But unfortunately, he was forced to abandon the plan because there must have been people around.
The investigators think that if Cyr had paid attention to the water level of the St. Charles, he probably would have made sure the victim sank and did not get stuck in the muddy bank.
The charge against the suspect was second-degree murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison.
Once again, a criminal foolishly believes water to be the perfect accomplice. In the end, the receding waters of the St. Charles River allowed Charles Tremblay some solace. source of life and cause of death. Water can wash away clues, dilute evidence, and conceal corpses. For investigators, water can be a cunning opponent. For criminals, a most accommodating ally. For the perfect crime, just add water. British Columbia lies on the picturesque west coast of Canada. Famous for its natural beauty, it has become infamous for its flourishing marijuana industry. Through the heart of the province runs the mighty Fraser River, which refused to be an accomplice in this complex investigation, rooted in a marijuana grow operation. On June 17, 1994, the captain of a tugboat on the Fraser River makes a grisly discovery. He immediately moors his load and calls the police.
I received information that an individual had been tangled up in a log boom on the Fraser River, and that log boom had subsequently been dragged across the Fraser River to the Langley side of the river. The area where the body was landed is an area called Darby Reach, and it's actually a provincial park, and there's a slight, small, sandy area. The body was recovered from that point, I believe with the assistance of the fire department.
Royal Canadian Mounted Police Corporal Gil Campbell arrives on the scene and makes another surprising discovery.
When I saw the body with the duct tape wrapped from the chin to just below the eyes, there was no doubt in my mind that this individual certainly didn't commit suicide by leaving all his clothes on and wrapping his head in duct tape and jumping off a bridge or what have you. There would be approximately 20 feet of duct tape around the head. It appeared the body had been in the Fraser River for some time. There was some deterioration throughout the body.
Investigators don't find any identification, scars, tattoos, or distinguishing marks on the body. So the victim is classified as unidentified human remains until more information is found. The identification process is very rigorous and must be foolproof.
We don't ever use legal or government-issued ID to identify someone. It could be a lead, but we would never look at a driver's license and say this is the person. We need to have a bona fide identification by someone who knows this individual, especially if someone's in their late teens but not quite 19. There's a chance someone may have fake ID on them that closely resembles them but isn't them. That can take the investigation into a very uneventful direction, and you also run the risk on a personal level of notifying family of a death that hasn't actually occurred.
The victim was taken to the New Westminster morgue, and the investigation continued in an attempt to identify the individual.
Gil Campbell has yet to learn that 2 days prior to the discovery of the body, RCMP received a call reporting the disappearance of an individual named Timothy Langmead.
The family had not heard from this individual for approximately 1 week, which they felt was unusual. The family believed actually he was living in a basement suite in Maple Ridge. All they had was a cell telephone number for him, and we subsequently did a subscriber check and found that the subscriber for that telephone actually lived on Prairie Avenue in Port Coquitlam.
The investigators go to Langmead's cell phone billing address in a suburb of Vancouver.
There was no vehicle around at all that Mr. Langmead might have driven, and they tried the front door and found it to be unlocked. The odor of marijuana was quite evident.
The police cannot legally enter the house without permission. So the RCMP requests a search warrant on the grounds that the Prairie Avenue house in Port Coquitlam is a marijuana grow-op. Meanwhile, the autopsy on the unidentified body proceeds. The pathologist starts by removing the duct tape that has been wrapped around the victim's head. It measures an astonishing 7 meters. The pathologist reports that the tape surrounding Langmead's head appeared to have shifted upwards after death. This is probably a result of river currents and the loosening of the skin on the deceased's head, which was due to prolonged immersion in the Fraser River. The pathologist formed this opinion because of the marked difference in the lividity on the skin around the victim's chin. A body floating in water tends to float face down, so blood accumulates by force of gravity in the tissues on the frontal portion of the body. This causes a discoloration known as lividity. Because the body was immersed for many days, lifting fingerprints from the remains proves challenging. To accomplish this, the forensic identification technician injects a saline solution beneath the surface of the skin. The fluid inflates the wrinkled skin to allow prints to be made. The pathologist reported damage to the liver and spleen, as well as pooling of several hundred cc's of blood in the abdomen. However, the pathologist could not determine if the injuries happened pre- or post-mortem.
Well, there were no visible external injuries on examination, and I know that he had sustained a number of lacerations to vital organs in his abdominal area. The pathologists and the other investigators also are able to determine with accuracy if an injury was sustained before the person died, or if they're in the Fraser River in a waterway where there's a lot of traffic. I mean, they're going to be constantly experiencing postmortem trauma.
The investigation into the disappearance of Timothy Langmead continues. The RCMP discovered that in addition to the house in Port Coquitlam, Langmead also has an apartment in Vancouver.
We suspected the individual might be our missing person that had been reported a week earlier. So we went to Vancouver, took various items like beer bottles, CDs, located fingerprints, and matched them up with the fingerprints that we had recovered from the victim.
The fingerprints from the unidentified remains and those collected from the apartment in Vancouver are a match. The victim is definitely Timothy Langmead. With the autopsy complete, the pathologist reports the victim died of asphyxiation or being deprived of air. It was not possible to determine if the cause was strangulation or drowning.
A drowning death is in fact an asphyxial death, so the cause of death was determined to be asphyxia, but just on the circumstances of the case, and the pathologist couldn't determine whether it was the asphyxial component of the tape itself or if it was immersion in the water. There was some evidence to suggest that Mr. Langmead was alive when he entered the water, so he determined that there were two factors in the asphyxial death, which was the tape and the water.
The investigators returned to Langmead's house in Port Coquitlam. They come prepared to put another suspected grow operation out of business. They quickly locate the source. But they are also looking for clues that will explain Langmead's demise.
They subsequently obtained a search warrant under the Narcotic Control Act, came back and found approximately 1,000 plants in the basement of this residence.
The illegal cultivation of marijuana in British Columbia is a huge underground industry, estimated to be several $billions. The RCMP are accustomed to this kind of discovery, and they follow procedure.
They would have dismantled the entire operation, including plants, lighting, and whatever. That would be all taken back to the Coquitlam detachment and logged in as exhibits.
As for clues that would explain the death of Timothy Langmead,
There was nothing else in the residence or nothing out of the ordinary other than the fact the basement had been an entire grow-up. It definitely looked like someone was living there. From the neighborhood inquiries, it indicated that Mr. Langmead was the one living there.
while the grow-up is being dismantled, police canvass the neighborhood, searching for more information.
We learned that one of the neighbors had observed a Mercedes vehicle attend at the residence on Prairie Avenue several times a week. And this neighbor happened to take down the license plate number of the Mercedes. And as a result of that, we followed up, found out who the registered owner was. Alan Gordon was the name of the individual that attended several times each week in the Mercedes.
Alan Cash Gordon is well known to police. He has a record for drug-related crimes and is currently on parole.
The parole officer issued a warrant for his immediate arrest as they were concerned that he might be involved in a grow operation at the Prairie Avenue residence. As a result of that, we arrested him.
Investigators interview Cash Gordon at the Coquitlam RCMP detachment. He admits knowing Timothy Langmead, but maintains that he only knows him as a gardener who has done landscaping for him.
His story was that he sold his information on how to set up grow-ops to individuals, but he personally had no involvement in the Prairie Avenue grow-op, other than the fact he would visit Timothy Langmead as a friend. Mr. Gordon had indicated that the only person who might have known about the grow-op was Mr. Riley.
Cash Gordon suggests that the police talk to Barry Riley, who lives in the small town of Lytton, British Columbia, a 3-hour drive from the Port Coquitlam house. Gordon explains Riley was involved in the setup of the electrical system at the Prairie Avenue grow-op. Before police have a chance to talk with Barry Riley, a dramatic event completely changes the course of the investigation.
That around the 20th or 21st of June, the residence on Prairie Avenue was torched. There was an arson, and it was confirmed there were 3 hot spots that indicated a fire had been set at the residence.
Corporal Campbell and his team realize this is a turning point in their investigation. The question on everyone's mind is simple. Who benefits from burning down a house that has already been busted? And more importantly, why? In June 1994, the RCMP are investigating 2 seemingly unrelated cases. The missing persons case of Timothy Langmead, a landscape gardener with no priors, and an unidentified body found tangled in a log boom on the Fraser River. Fingerprints confirm the body pulled from the Fraser River is that of Timothy Langmead. His phone records lead the investigators to one of his residences, which doubled as a marijuana grow operation. A few days after the Port Coquitlam grow-op is dismantled by the RCMP, the house was destroyed by arson. "190 kilometers northeast of Port Coquitlam is a spectacular canyon on the Fraser River called Hell's Gate. 3 weeks after Timothy Langmead's body was discovered, a van was found clinging to the cliff north of Hell's Gate. There are no license plates on the vehicle, but police are still able to trace the owner.
Through the VIN number on the vehicle, we identified it as being Tim Langmead's. It was found by a tourist who was taking photographs who had gone to the edge of the cliff drop, and he looked down and saw the van approximately 200 feet down the cliff. We used a tow truck with a long line, and basically the van was pulled up from that location and towed eventually to the Coquitlam RCMP detachment for further investigation by our forensic units. Someone had tried to start a fire inside the van, but obviously on its tumble down the cliff, the fire had gone out.
Unfortunately for the investigators, very little usable evidence is found. However, the forensic identification officers keep at it, and their persistence finally pays off.
There was a piece of paper recovered from the van, and it appeared it was Barry Riley's pager number.
Corporal Gil Campbell now has another reason to question Barry Riley. He and his partner set out for Lytton, 55 kilometers north of Hell's Gate, where Riley is living.
And we arranged to meet him at the Lytton RCMP detachment on the 27th of July, 1994. And he was a person of interest at that time because his name had been given to us by Gordon, and we intended on finding out what his relationship was with regards to Timothy Langmead and the residents on Prairie Avenue.
The police already know that Barry Riley has unusual family circumstances.
His father was a serving member of the RCMP at that time, and the lady that was attached with his father, she was also a member of the drug squad for the RCMP. His mother was cohabitating with another member of the RCMP who was currently on duty at that time with the Lytton Detachment RCMP.
Riley is informed that the conversation will be recorded.
We really did want to find out what was the relationship with Timothy Langmead and Kesh Gordon, because we had other stories as to what his involvement was, so we wanted his side of it, because there was certainly no criminal evidence available at that time. I think he knew that when we had mentioned Kesh Gordon, he obviously realized that Mr. Gordon had told us information about him, that he worked for Mr. Gordon on another grow-op, that he set up the grow-op on Prairie. That information would only have come from Kesh Gordon.
It is clear to Corporal Campbell that Riley is well aware of the RCMP's investigation techniques because of his family background.
He obviously felt that he might as well come clean on the drugs, because we certainly, with his admission, couldn't charge him for anything drug-related anyway, and he just wanted to distance himself from any homicide. He indicated he had worked for Kesh Gordon. As a matter of fact, prior to the Prairie grow-op, he was looking after another grow-op for Mr. Gordon. I think the reason he gave us the information was to certainly say, look, he's not an angel, and this is what I do, but I don't murder people.
Riley admits that he did the electrical installation at the Prairie Avenue grow-op. He also says that he had never been paid for his work.
According to Riley, the statement he gave to the police, sometime shortly after the 8th of June, Gordon had driven up to Lytton to contact Riley. Kesh Gordon had threatened him with physical violence. Gordon told him that he has friends with guns, so if he's ripping them off, he better beware. And secondly, he said that Gordon's prints, as well as Riley's prints, would probably be in the residence on Prairie, and he would have to try and get rid of them. And of course, we know that later that month, the month of June, the residence is torched. The arson was investigated, and at that time, and even subsequently, no one was arrested and charged.
Although the RCMP have 2 suspects who could have set fire to the grow-op on Prairie Avenue, there is not enough evidence to lay charges. The police decide to give priority to the Langmead investigation. After hours of interrogation, Campbell doesn't believe that Riley has told him everything. With no other leads to follow, the RCMP decide to launch a public appeal in the lower mainland of British Columbia. They ask people to call a tips line, hoping to get new information.
We received a tip from an individual stating that 3 individuals were involved and gave us pertinent details regarding why they went down to Port Coquitlam and what they did. This information was received from the tipster that only a person who was involved would have known.
The anonymous tip reveals 3 individuals in question: David Henry, Barry Riley, and a minor. They all live in Lytton. The investigators are aware that Barry Riley is familiar with their techniques and is cautious of their questioning. Can Gil Campbell and his team find a way to get Riley to make an unwitting admission? In June 1994, the body of Timothy Langmead is found tangled in a Fraser River log boom. Investigators discovered that Langmead was the gardener of a marijuana grow-op that was robbed and later burned down. The murderer is still at large. The RCMP have 3 main suspects: Barry Riley, David Henry, and a minor. RCMP Corporal Gil Campbell decides to set up an undercover operation. He wants to get Barry Riley to disclose what happened with Timothy Langmead and to implicate his accomplices. Investigators put together a brief of all the evidence they have so far about Langmead, his relationship with the suspects, and the Port Coquitlam grow-op.
The way it is with most of these grow-ops is that they'll hire someone who's unsuspecting to the public, and at the same time, usually that individual is quite well paid, and their job is basically to live at the residence and make sure the plants grow, and do not discuss what he does or what's going on at the residence with anyone. Timothy Langmead's role at the Prairie Avenue residence was strictly as a gardener. His background was a gardener. On any given day, Mr. Langmead would have had to make sure that the plants were getting enough water, also getting enough heat from the heat lamps. As I recall, they were getting about 4 crops a year, the way they had the plants staggered. And of course, once each section of the grow-op was harvested, they would be responsible for cutting it up and bagging it and eventually getting rid of it.
The RCMP undercover operation is ready to target their first suspect, Barry Riley. Corporal Gil Campbell warns the undercover officers about the added challenge of this covert operation.
Barry Riley came from a police-oriented family, and there was concerns that he might be savvy to police techniques in areas of investigation and interrogation. After considering various options, we decided to run with the undercover operation, with the target initially being Barry Riley.
The undercover team reserves a motel room. They set up hidden cameras, microphones, and recording equipment. They will invite Riley and try to get him to admit his role in the murder of Langmead.
Depending on the type of case that we're working on, will really dictate the type of covert equipment we'll use, both audio or video. When we initially assess the case, if we know that it's fairly sensitive and the individuals may be suspicious, then we'll tie it into, build it into a pair of glasses, to a brooch on somebody's lapel, to watches, pens, belt buckle, hearing aid, cell phone, pretty much anything that you can imagine. If we can actually wire a location in advance prior to conducting a sting, then we can use things that will blend into that home or office or whatever the location is. We can use things like clocks, clock radios, little portable radios, motion sensors that are tied into an existing alarm system, alarm panels. We've built them into carbon monoxide testers and smoke detectors.
The undercover officers meticulously prepare for their encounter with Barry Riley.
When we look at the subject and we get a good understanding of what they do, where they go, who they associate with, everything about them, get them to the point where the investigator knows them as if that they're their best friend. They study all of their movements, habits, things that they like, dislikes, you name it. It's important because you need to be able to not just fit in, but you need to be able to anticipate those potential surprises that are going to catch you off guard. And that fraction of a moment can make or break your case. If your cover is blown, your investigation's over, and all of that work that you've put towards, getting yourself into that situation is gone.
The undercover officers convince Barry Riley to meet with them for a chat in the motel room, wired with covert recording equipment.
I believe this was late September, early October, 1994. Mr. Riley was suspicious of the two undercover operators. In fact, indicated to them that he believed they were either bikers or police, and either way, he didn't want to associate with them.
When a subject has been heated up or is suspicious of any type of investigation around them, it definitely becomes a lot more challenging.
The undercover operation with Riley is abandoned.
If there is a situation where you know that they're going to be expecting an investigator or an operative, then we'll double up on our investigation. We'll create two stings instead of one. And the first one is the initial attempt to develop the relationship with the subject. And the second one is just hovering in the background, allowing or waiting for opportunity for the subject to draw us in.
2 months later, the RCMP moved forward with phase 2 of the undercover operation. This time, their target is David Henry. To be consistent, the undercover officers use the same story as they did with Riley. They claim to be gang members.
He was actually bragging to the undercover operators to show them how bad he was or how mean he was. Of course, and as time continued and his contact with the undercover operators continued, he came around and told more a story of what we believe occurred.
Contrary to his friend Barry Riley, David Henry is a more cooperative subject. He is completely unguarded and unaware that his conversation is being videotaped. After several drinks, he tells them about the events of June 8, 1994. The undercover agents record Henry saying that he and Riley went down to a man's grow-op to steal his money. Riley knew him because he had set up the electrical. Henry boasts that they entered the grow-op and he beat the man in the legs with a steel bar before strangling him with his bare hands. Henry adds that Riley stole $6,000 that was hidden inside a wall, but left the marijuana behind. He also says that he and Riley hog-tied the man and drove him up to Hell's Gate in his own van. Wanting to impress the undercover officers, Henry tells them that they stabbed the man's stomach and chest with a knife so he would not float. Then he tied the spare tire to the body and with Riley's help threw him into the Fraser River from the Alexandra Bridge at Hell's Gate along the highway to Lytton. The undercover officers asked David Henry if the body was recovered. He boasts about reading it in the paper and thinking it was cool because he knew they were responsible. When asked what happened to the van, Henry describes pushing it over a cliff into Hell's Gate. The undercover officers decide to move to the next phase of the operation. They must apply for a warrant to target Barry Riley once more. They decide to keep David Henry with them until the warrant is granted. That way, they keep him from contacting Riley, which could risk spoiling their plans. Henry is eager to spend time with the men he believes to be real gang members. He hopes to impress them and to be recruited into their organization.
The undercover operators had Mr. Henry with them for about 4 or 5 days, which I believe was unknown to Mr. Riley.
They want Henry to make contact with Barry Riley and lure him into a meeting. Henry tells them that Riley has moved to Kamloops, British Columbia.
So it was set up through warrants that we would do the same thing again, audio and video, and that Mr. Henry would call Mr. Riley, come over and have a few beers. I believe it was around the 7th of January of 1995.
If we have a subject that's somewhat heated up or suspecting, some type of surveillance to be done, then we will utilize several vehicles. We'll switch them up. We'll make sure that one really stands out. We'll make it seem like they're burnt, and we'll have already anticipated their entire routine.
Unaware that his friend David Henry is accompanied by the same 2 undercover officers, Riley agrees to join Henry.
Riley realized that Mr. Henry was with the undercover operators, the individuals who had targeted him in September, early October. Riley is very reluctant to speak, and one of the undercover operators has a bit of an argument with him. If one listens to the transcript, what happens is Mr. Riley disclosing his involvement and confirming what David Henry had told to the undercover operators.
Realizing that they probably have the confessions they were looking for, the officers decide to leave Henry and Riley alone for a few minutes while the cameras are still rolling.
There was a time during this undercover operation in Kamloops when Mr. Riley and Mr. Henry were alone. Riley is heard telling Henry that he doesn't trust these guys, or something to that effect.
Will the confessions obtained by the undercover officers be sufficient to arrest Barry Riley and David Henry? Is there enough evidence to find them guilty of murder? June 1994. The body of Timothy Langmead is pulled from the Fraser River. The prime suspects are Barry Riley and David Henry. Investigators work for 7 months to build a case for murder. The RCMP use an undercover operation to obtain confessions that seal their case against the suspects. The undercover operation is successful. The prosecution has enough evidence to arrest 3 suspects for the murder of Timothy Langmead. Barry Riley, David Henry, and their young accomplice are arrested on the charge of second-degree murder. The suspects are interrogated separately. Investigators are looking for more details to corroborate the statements recorded in the undercover operation. They begin with Barry Riley.
Myself and another investigator went in and spoke with him, and he subsequently admitted to his involvement.
Barry Riley knew Kesh Gordon for some time. He had worked for him months earlier.
He had been hired by Kesh Gordon to do the electrical work and set up the grow-op on Prairie. At that time, he was looking after his own grow-op in another residence in Port Coquitlam.
Barry Riley resented Kesh Gordon for not having paid him for the work he had done on Prairie Avenue. That's what motivated Riley to rob the grow-op that Langmead was managing.
Mr. Riley, it appeared, was the main person in this operation, and it's our understanding that it was his idea to take his 2 friends with him to go down to the Lower Mainland to rip off the grow operation.
During a party in Lytton, Riley convinces his friends to help him rip off the Prairie Avenue grow-op. They borrow a car, and from Lytton, the diabolical events are set into motion on June 8, 1994. The grow-op is in Port Coquitlam, a 3-hour drive south of Lytton. The men drink beer and rum heavily during the trip. Barry Riley knows that the grow-op is probably guarded by Timothy Langmead. In anticipation of a fight with Langmead, they bring duct tape and rope in case they need to subdue him. They arrive at the Prairie Avenue house, but see no signs of Timothy Langmead. Riley and Henry manage to break in and enter the grow-op. Riley sends Henry and the young accomplice downstairs to harvest the marijuana while he looks for cash.
The investigation indicated that this was strictly a grow-op rip, and they had gone down with the intentions of getting some free marijuana. Unfortunately, as things turned out, Mr. Langmead came home while they were still at the door.
Langmead immediately realizes what is happening. The discussion quickly turns to a fight.
They subsequently tied Mr. Langmead up to a chair in the kitchen. Because he was shouting and he wouldn't be quiet, they subsequently put duct tape around him.
Henry tapes Langmead's mouth shut. Riley goes to the basement to help steal the marijuana. David Henry is left alone with Langmead.
I believe it was Mr. Henry that put the duct tape around the victim's head.
Riley returns a few minutes later. He finds Langmead tied to the chair lying on the floor. Henry had completely wrapped Langmead's head with duct tape. He is not breathing. The men do not panic when they realize they have killed Langmead. They systematically finish stealing the rest of the mature marijuana plants.
They cut as much as they could, loaded it in the victim's van. And they also took the victim and pushed him in the back of the van as well. They also took the victim's guitar, which was subsequently recovered from another individual in Lytton. And there was a VCR as well that was taken. They drove back to Lytton with the victim in his own van.
The first order of business is to dispose of Langmead's body and his vehicle. The road back to Lytton offers the men many opportunities to do so. Riley pulls off the road near the Alexandra Bridge, an old abandoned bridge that crosses the Fraser River near Hell's Gate. The license plates are removed from the van while Riley and Henry dispose of Langmead's body.
They throw the body over the Alexandra Bridge. And then they took the van, took all the marijuana out of the van, and just a couple of miles north of there, north of Hell's Gate, and then they dumped it over the cliff.
The men then return to Lytton, confident that their crime will never be discovered. The police know that in the days following their return to Lytton, the accused quickly found buyers for the drugs they had stolen. After 10 months, the RCMP has gathered evidence and successfully completed a complex undercover operation to build a strong case. Will it be enough for the prosecutor to convict Barry Riley, David Henry, and the young accomplice for the murder of Timothy Langmead? Thanks to the RCMP undercover operation, Barry Riley and David Henry confessed to the murder of Timothy Langmead on June 8, 1994. The recorded confessions of the two defendants explain in detail how they beat him, wrapped his head in 7 meters of duct tape, and threw his body into the Fraser River. Finally, with the strength of the prosecutor's case and witness testimony, the charges against the accused are upgraded.
After the swearing of the charges, which would be sometime in January of 1995, the charges were bumped up to first degree. And that was because of the fact when you confine someone against their will, it becomes automatically a first degree offense.
The prosecutor decides there is not enough evidence against the young offender. The charges against him are stayed, and he is released. The trial of Barry Riley and David Henry continues. One of the first witnesses brought to the stand by the prosecutor is none other than Kesh Gordon.
Mr. Gordon actually attended as a witness for the prosecution, and his story was that he sold his information on how to set up grow-ops to individuals, but he personally had no involvement in the Prairie Avenue grow-op, other than the fact he would visit Timothy Langmead as a friend.
The trial lasts several weeks. The jury delivers a guilty verdict without hesitation. Barry Riley and David Henry are currently serving 22-year prison sentences. On 3 occasions between 1995 and 2010, Barry Riley and David Henry attempt to appeal their sentences, citing a variety of reasons. On each occasion, the original first-degree murder conviction is upheld, and the two criminals must continue to serve their prison sentences. The arson of the grow-op on Prairie Avenue in the center of this story has never been solved. But the police suspect that the arsonist can be found among the individuals involved in the grow-op. The perpetrators thought by throwing the body into the watery gate of hell, it would disappear forever and that they could go on with their lives. Instead, the river spit out the evidence of their crime and their own lives changed forever. But once again, What could have remained an unpunished crime, drowned in the raging waters of Hell's Gate, turned out quite different thanks to the unpredictable nature of water.